When morning light spread across the Montana Territory on June 26, 1876, the warm air still held a sharp tang of expended gunpowder over the undulating hills. The Little Bighorn River, typically clear and unspoiled, now coursed by the strewn remnants of one of the most shocking military setbacks in U.S. history. As Native American fighters returned to their encampments in victory and the few remaining U.S. troopers emerged from their fortified positions, neither group could fully comprehend how this lone engagement would forever alter the story of the American West. In the haunting calm of dawn on June 26, 1876, General Alfred Terry's relief force neared the Little Bighorn battlefield through a terrain that would eternally trouble those who saw it. The morning fog, laced with the faint haze of spent powder, slowly unveiled a scene of unparalleled destruction that would carve itself into American memory. Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, surviving soldiers, who had withstood a valiant stand on the ridge, were the first to grasp the full extent of the catastrophe as they descended to search for their fallen brothers. The sight that met them surpassed their gravest fears. Spread across the rolling Montana landscape lay the fallen troopers of the Seventh Cavalry, their remains silently narrating the battle's final moments. The discovery of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's body, beside his brothers Tom and Boston, nephew Artie Reed, and brother-in-law James Calhoun, cast a stark image of the conflict's decisive end. Custer was located near the crest of what would later be called Last Stand Hill, marked by 2 bullet wounds, one near his chest and another at his left temple. Unlike later tales of desecration, his body remained largely intact, a gesture of honor some Native American warriors extended to courageous foes. The duty of identifying and retrieving the deceased fell to the surviving 7th Cavalry members, many of whom had to confront the faces of comrades they had dined with days earlier. The summer heat had ravaged the bodies, making identification an urgent and emotionally grueling task. Soldiers worked systematically across the field, noting each spot where a comrade had fallen, forming the first crude sketch of the battle's closing moments. Lieutenant Edward McClernand, among the first officers to arrive with Terry's column, recorded the scene in his field journal. His words conveyed the deep impact of witnessing such widespread ruin. The dead lay as they had fought, positioned behind lines, revealing where defensive stances had been taken and held, until none remained to resist. The disciplined order that defined the 7th Cavalry in life persisted in death, their final formations etched across the Montana terrain. Native American accounts later gathered by scholars disclosed that most warriors had left the battlefield by dawn on June 26, taking their dead and injured with them. They left behind numerous traces of their triumph, scattered cartridge shells, broken arrows, and personal belongings that would later aid in reconstructing the battle's progression. The vast encampment that had sheltered thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had vanished into the landscape, leaving only trampled grass and sparse remnants as proof of their presence. The task of burying the dead began almost immediately. The summer heat and the sheer number of casualties made transporting bodies to a military outpost impossible. Most soldiers were interred where they fell in shallow graves marked by stakes. Custer's body, along with those of his officers, received slightly more formal burials, though still hastily performed under the circumstances. These initial burials would later prove temporary, as many families requested the return of their loved ones' remains for reburial elsewhere. Lieutenant John Burke, arriving with General Terry's column, noted the professionalism with which the surviving troopers carried out their duties despite their evident sorrow. He described men working in silence mechanically, their faces set in resolute determination as they fulfilled their grim task. The only sounds were the steady thud of shovels striking earth, and the occasional sharp command from an officer overseeing the burial details. The documentation of the battlefield commenced almost immediately. Lieutenant Edward McGuire, the Engineer Corps, began mapping the site, creating detailed charts that would later prove invaluable to historians. Field surgeons examined the deceased, recorded wounds, and compiled medical reports that would help piece together the battle's events. Officers gathered personal effects, letters, photographs, watches, and rings, to be sent to grieving families in the East. As word of the catastrophe spread, more soldiers and civilians arrived at the battlefield. Among them were journalists who dispatched the first detailed accounts of the aftermath to a stunned nation. Their reports, though occasionally exaggerated, captured the raw emotion of those initial days, the stench of death under the scorching Montana sun, the sight of personal items strewn across the field, and the profound silence that seemed to envelop the entire region. The initial military reports, hurriedly drafted in the field, struggled to make sense of the disaster. The absence of survivors from Custer's immediate command meant that critical details of the battle's final moments would remain elusive. Officers pieced together what they could from physical evidence, the positions of the bodies, and the testimonies of surviving troops from Reno and Bentine's commands. As the sun set on those first critical days after the battle, the immediate work of recovery and documentation was largely complete. The dead were buried, their locations recorded, and the first official reports were en route to Washington. Yet the repercussions of what had transpired along the Little Bighorn River were only beginning to unfold. The aftermath of those initial days would trigger a series of events that would reshape the American West, transform U.S. Indian policy, and create a cultural milestone that would be debated for generations. When the first telegrams carrying news of the Little Bighorn disaster reached the East Coast, they arrived during the nation's centennial celebrations. The stark contrast between festive 4th of July events and reports of Custer's annihilation sent a shockwave through American society. In Philadelphia, where thousands had gathered to mark the nation's 100th anniversary, the joyful mood turned somber as newsboys shouted headlines that would forever alter the nation's view of its westward expansion. General Alfred Terry's official report to Washington, written in restrained military prose, masked the emotional weight of the news. His opening words, "It is my painful duty to report," introduced a document that would shake the foundations of military and political institutions. The report, landing on President Ulysses S. Grant's desk during a sweltering July morning, prompted an urgent cabinet meeting. Grant, who had privately questioned Custer's judgment, now faced a public relations crisis that threatened to overshadow his administration's final months. Eastern newspapers seized the story with unprecedented zeal. The New York Herald's front page blared massacre in bold print, while the Chicago Tribune dedicated entire sections to profiles of the fallen officers. These early reports, often based on incomplete information and tinged with the era's racial biases, painted vivid pictures of savage warfare that inflamed public sentiment. Editors, sensing the public's hunger for details, sent special correspondents to Montana. Their telegraph dispatches filled columns and dominated public discourse for weeks. In Congress, politicians who had previously ignored frontier issues now demanded swift action. Senator William Stewart of Nevada declared from the Senate floor, "The blood of our soldiers demands retribution." His words echoed a growing public sentiment calling for decisive vengeance against Native American tribes. Congressional committees quickly convened hearings, summoning military experts and Indian agents to testify about the conditions leading to this devastating defeat. The public's response was multifaceted. In the East, where many had never encountered Native Americans, the battle fueled existing fears and prejudices. Charitable societies organized relief efforts for the widows and orphans of the Seventh Cavalry, while citizens sent impassioned letters to their representatives demanding a stronger military presence on the frontier. The battle became a rallying cry for advocates of harsher Indian policies. Yet among reform-minded intellectuals and religious leaders, the disaster sparked reflection on the nation's treatment of Native Americans. The Boston Globe published editorials questioning the wisdom of current Indian policies, while religious journals advocated for a more compassionate approach to tribal relations. These voices, though initially overshadowed by calls for revenge, would later influence late 19th century reform movements. Military circles buzzed with analysis and critique. Officers who had long doubted Custer's tactics found their views suddenly sought after. Veterans of frontier campaigns wrote detailed analyses for professional journals, dissecting every known detail of the battle. The Army and Navy Journal ran articles examining the strategic and tactical lessons of the defeat, sparking debates among officers about cavalry doctrine and Indian fighting methods. President Grant's administration faced intense pressure to act decisively. The president, a seasoned military commander, understood the complexities of frontier warfare better than most politicians. Yet public opinion demanded action, and Grant authorized additional troops and resources for the Department of Dakota. His military advisors worked urgently to devise new strategies to address what was now seen as a significant threat to Western settlement. The battle's impact on national policy was immediate and enduring. Democrats, seeking political advantage, blamed Republican Indian policies for the defeat, pointing to corruption in the Indian Bureau and accusing the administration of incompetence. These attacks during an election year forced both parties to address Indian policy in their platforms, though their solutions often reflected political expediency rather than practical wisdom. In newspapers, artists rushed to create illustrations of the battle and its aftermath. Without photographs of the actual conflict, these dramatic depictions shape public perception. The images, often more imaginative than accurate, portrayed heroic last stands and fierce warfare, creating lasting impressions that would influence American popular culture for generations. The business community also reacted to the crisis. Arms manufacturers saw increased orders as Western settlements sought weapons for self-defense. Railroad companies, concerned about the safety of their routes, lobbied for greater military protection. The battle even influenced fashion, as Eastern manufacturers produced frontier-style clothing and accessories to capitalize on renewed interest in the West. As summer turned to fall, the initial shock of the Little Bighorn evolved into a deeper shift in how Americans viewed their nation's westward expansion. The confident belief in manifest destiny gave way to a more nuanced understanding of the challenges and costs of continental conquest. The battle became more than a military failure. It emerged as a cultural turning point, marking the end of one era in American history and the beginning of another. The public reaction to the Little Bighorn would continue to shape policy and perception for decades, influencing everything from military reform to popular culture. The immediate aftermath set in motion changes that would ultimately transform the American West. Few who read those initial shocking headlines could have foreseen the full extent of the battle's lasting impact on the national consciousness. The bloodshed at Little Bighorn became the catalyst for one of the most comprehensive military reforms in American frontier history. The humiliation of losing an entire battalion to Native American forces demanded not just a response, but a complete overhaul of military doctrine, strategy, and operations. In the War Department's smoke-filled rooms, generals studied maps and reports, their expressions somber as they confronted the stark reality of their tactical shortcomings. The traditional methods of cavalry operations, bold charges, divided commands, and reliance on outdated European tactics had proven disastrously inadequate against the sophisticated strategies of the Plains tribes. General Philip Sheridan, commander of the Military Division of the Missouri, issued transformative directives that would reshape frontier military operations for decades. The first major change was the abandonment of small unit operations. No longer would cavalry companies venture alone into hostile territory. New protocols required units to operate in concentrated strength, with multiple companies moving in coordinated formations. The image of the gallant cavalry officer leading a small detachment on a glory-driven mission was replaced by the more cautious reality of large, well-supplied columns operating with mutual support. Communication became critical in this new era of frontier warfare. The Army established a network of heliograph stations across the Western territories, using mirrors to send messages over vast distances. These stations, positioned on high ground and staffed continuously, created an information network to track Native American movements and coordinate military responses. The era of isolated commands operating without knowledge of supporting forces was over. Training was radically revised. The Army's Cavalry School at Fort Riley, Kansas, overhauled its curriculum. Officers who once focused on perfecting saber techniques now studied Native American warfare, terrain analysis, and dismounted combat tactics. The focus shifted from dramatic charges to practical battlefield effectiveness. Supply lines, previously vulnerable, received significant attention. New regulations required cavalry units to travel with pack mules carrying extra ammunition and supplies, eliminating the need for slow, exposed wagon trains. This change enhanced mobility while increasing operational endurance in the field. The Army also began systematically recruiting Native American scouts, whose expertise in terrain, tracking, and warfare proved invaluable. Their integration into military operations marked a subtle but significant shift in how the Army approached frontier conflicts. Weapons and equipment evolved in response to the lessons of Little Bighorn. The Army prioritized repeating rifles over single-shot weapons, acknowledging the superior firepower often wielded by Native American warriors. New cavalry carbines were issued, and soldiers were rigorously trained in their use. Training also emphasized dismounted fighting tactics, recognizing that horses could be a liability in certain terrain. Field fortification became standard practice. Officers were trained to quickly establish defensive positions using natural terrain and hasty entrenchments. The memory of Reno's men digging in with makeshift tools underscored the importance of this training. Frontier posts grew larger and more strategically placed. Small isolated forts were deemed inadequate, and the Army consolidated its presence into better supplied installations capable of supporting extended operations. These posts were positioned to control key terrain and water sources critical to both military and Native American movements. Weather monitoring and seasonal planning became integral to military strategy. The Little Bighorn disaster highlighted the risks of operations without considering environmental conditions. New protocols required commanders to account for seasonal patterns, weather forecasts, and terrain conditions when planning campaigns. These reforms faced resistance from traditionalist officers who viewed the new restrictions as hindrances to decisive action. Yet the memory of Little Bighorn, the cost of underestimating their adversaries, provided a compelling case for change. The transformation marked the beginning of a more modern, systematic approach to warfare that would influence American military doctrine into the 20th century. The reforms were tested in subsequent campaigns. As the Army pursued the Sioux, Cheyenne, and other tribes across the northern plains, the new tactics proved effective, gradually eroding Native American resistance through persistent, coordinated operations rather than dramatic battles. The Romantic era of frontier cavalry warfare ended, replaced by a more methodical, professional approach that would ultimately complete the conquest of the American West. The victory at Little Bighorn, which initially filled Native American hearts with pride and hope, proved a bittersweet triumph that hastened their people's tragedy. As the summer of 1876 faded into autumn, the great coalition of tribes that had united against Custer began to fracture under an unprecedented military response. The victory that seemed so decisive in June marked, in hindsight, the beginning of the end for the Plains tribes' free-roaming life. Sitting Bull, a spiritual leader who had foreseen Custer's defeat, watched as his alliance unraveled. The massive encampment at Little Bighorn, possibly the largest gathering of Plains Indians in history, could not sustain itself against intensified military pursuit. Food grew scarce as the Army's presence made buffalo hunting perilous. The harsh realities of survival overshadowed the joy of victory. The U.S. Army's response was relentless. General Nelson Miles launched a winter campaign that devastated Native American resistance. Unlike previous commanders, Miles pursued the tribes through Montana's brutal winter, denying them seasonal respite. His troops, better equipped and following reform protocols, maintained constant pressure on bands seeking freedom. Crazy Horse, the tactical genius behind the Little Bighorn victory, found his options dwindling. The warrior's path, long central to his people's survival, became untenable against overwhelming military force. The Army's sustained pursuit tactics left villages with no safe havens, even in remote regions. A constant movement to evade military columns made gathering food and supplies nearly impossible. The pressure manifested in tragic ways. Children and elders suffered during the harsh winter of 1876–77. Food shortages forced some bands to eat their horses, a desperate act that struck at the core of Plains culture. The warriors who had triumphed at Little Bighorn watched helplessly as their families faced starvation and exposure. Smaller bands began breaking away from the main group. Some sought refuge in Canada, while others reluctantly headed to reservations. The military strategy of dividing the alliance proved effective, as bands faced a stark choice between resistance and survival. Each surrender weakened the remaining resistance, making independence harder to sustain. The impact on tribal leadership was significant. Traditional chiefs faced challenges to their authority as younger members advocated for varied responses to the crisis. Internal conflicts weakened tribal unity and accelerated the erosion of traditional social structures. Reservation life brought its own challenges and indignities. Warriors who once roamed freely now found themselves confined, dependent on government rations, and subject to Indian agents' authority. The transition was especially bitter for Little Bighorn veterans, whose greatest victory had paradoxically accelerated their confinement. The spiritual toll was profound. Traditional practices, often tied to sacred sites, became difficult or impossible under reservation restrictions. The Ghost Dance movement, emerging later, reflected a desperate hope for supernatural restoration of the old ways, but it too ended in tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1890. The landscape that witnessed the Little Bighorn triumph was transformed. Buffalo herds and open ranges essential to Plains life were systematically destroyed. Railroads and settler communities carved up the prairies, altering the physical space that sustained the nomadic lifestyle. Adaptation was painful but profound. Some, like Sitting Bull, resisted until the end, refusing to fully accept a new reality. Others sought to preserve cultural identity while navigating change. Young people attended government schools, traditional practices went underground, and survival meant finding ways to maintain identity within reservation confines. Within a generation, the free-roaming life of the Plains tribes had largely vanished. The victory that seemed to promise preservation instead marked its end. The bitter irony was not lost on survivors and their descendants. Their greatest military triumph unleashed forces that transformed their world beyond recognition. Yet in this transformation, the spirit of resistance and cultural preservation found new expressions. The legacy of Little Bighorn, while marking the end of one chapter, became a symbol of resilience, reminding future generations of a time when the Plains tribe stood united in defense of their way of life. This memory, passed down, helped sustain cultural identity through the challenges that followed. The cultural impact of the Little Bighorn battle rippled through American society, shaping the nation's understanding of itself for generations. In the immediate aftermath, as the nation grappled with the defeat's magnitude, a peculiar transformation occurred. The story of Custer's last stand evolved from a military disaster into a cultural touchstone that would captivate the American imagination for over a century. In Eastern saloons and frontier cabins, the battle was retold and reimagined countless times. Each retelling added layers to what became the Custer myth. The flamboyant officer, whose career had been marked by both brilliance and controversy, was transformed in death into a larger-than-life hero. The press, once critical of him, now portrayed him as the epitome of American valor. Brave, daring, and martyred in the cause of progress. Early accounts of the battle reflected the era's biases. Elizabeth Custer, the general's widow, played a key role in shaping her husband's legacy. Her books, such as Boots and Saddles, offered an intimate portrait of Army life and her husband's character, influencing historians for decades. Her efforts to enhance Custer's reputation helped establish the romantic narrative that dominated popular understanding. The battlefield became a site of pilgrimage and debate. In 1879, a memorial was erected over the mass grave of reburied soldiers. Its transformation into a national cemetery and later a national monument reflected shifting views of the battle's significance. For decades, the site's official interpretation focused on the military perspective, with little acknowledgement of the Native American victory or its context. Artists found endless inspiration in the battle. Painters like Edgar Samuel Paxson created dramatic depictions of Custer's last stand that shaped public imagination. These images, often showing Custer in a heroic pose surrounded by warriors, bore little resemblance to reality but became iconic. They adorned barrooms, appeared in history books, and were reproduced as prints in countless homes. The entertainment industry embraced the story. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show featured reenactments of the battle, sometimes with Native American participants who had fought at Little Bighorn, though often cast as the defeated. These performances, seen by millions, cemented a particular narrative in popular culture. Native American oral histories told a different story. In their accounts, the battle was the Battle of the Greasy Grass, emphasizing their perspective and victory. These narratives, long ignored by historians, provided critical details and countered the prevailing white narrative. They spoke of strategic brilliance, warriors protecting their families, and a victory that carried the seeds of future tragedy. Academic historians gradually challenged the traditional narrative. New research, archaeological discoveries, and a growing openness to Native American perspectives led to more nuanced interpretations. The simplistic tale of heroic cavalry versus savage warriors gave way to complex discussions of tactics, cultural conflict, and American expansion. The battlefield became a laboratory for evolving historical interpretation. Archaeological work in the 1980s revealed new details, challenging long-held assumptions. Artifacts like cartridge cases and personal items helped reconstruct the battle's final moments, often contradicting romantic myths and official accounts. The evolution of the battle's interpretation mirrored broader societal changes. As the civil rights movement and Native American activism grew, new voices challenged the traditional narrative. The Battle of Little Bighorn became a focal point for discussions about colonialism, cultural preservation, and historical justice. The site's renaming from Custer Battlefield to Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument in 1991 symbolized a shift. The cultural legacy of Little Bighorn continues to evolve. Modern interpretations recognize the event's complexity. Custer is seen as a multifaceted figure, reflecting his era's contradictions. The Native American victory is understood as part of a broader struggle for cultural survival. The battle remains a powerful symbol, its meaning shaped by who tells the story. The aftermath of Little Bighorn reshaped American Indian policy with sweeping force, dismantling decades of inconsistent approaches and ushering in an era of unprecedented federal control. In Washington's smoke-filled rooms, politicians and bureaucrats who had previously ignored the Indian problem scrambled to implement changes that would redefine the relationship between the U.S. and indigenous peoples. Secretary of the Interior Carl Schurz, taking office in 1877, inherited a chaotic system. The Little Bighorn defeat exposed deep flaws in Native American relations. Corruption plagued the Indian Bureau, with agents diverting supplies meant for reservations and appointees prioritizing personal gain over effective administration. Schurz acted swiftly, launching investigations that removed dozens of corrupt officials. The reservation system, previously a temporary measure, became a tool for forced cultural change designed to dismantle tribal structures and impose American systems. The philosophy of "kill the Indian, save the man" defined federal policy for decades. Congress acted quickly to pass laws affecting Native American lives. The Indian Appropriations Act of 1871 had ended treaty-making, but post-Little Bighorn policies went further, restricting movement, regulating tribal governance, and imposing American legal systems. The goal was to prevent any future military challenge to federal authority. Education became a tool of cultural transformation. The government expanded Indian boarding schools, forcibly separating children from their communities. These schools, far from reservations, aimed to erase tribal identities, banning native languages, clothing, and beliefs. The psychological impact would resonate for generations. Reservation land policies shifted dramatically. Communal tribal lands were replaced with individual allotments under the Dawes Act of 1887, a direct result of post-Little Bighorn attitudes. Dividing tribal lands aimed to destroy collective identity and prevent resistance. Economic policies grew more restrictive. Traditional hunting was curtailed, forcing reliance on government rations, which became a tool of control. Rations were withheld from non-compliant families, reducing once independent warriors to dependency. Religious freedom was severely limited. Traditional ceremonies were banned, medicine men persecuted, and spiritual practices driven underground. The ghost dance movement, a response to these restrictions, was violently suppressed, culminating in the Wounded Knee Massacre. Justice on reservations became harsher. Indian police, staffed by tribal members but controlled by white agents, expanded. Traditional conflict resolution was replaced by American courts, further eroding chiefs' authority and creating lasting divisions. Healthcare, promised in treaties, became a means of control. Reservation doctors and nurses reported on tribal activities and encouraged white customs. Traditional healing was discouraged, forcing reliance on inadequate government services. Tribal governance was profoundly affected. Traditional leadership structures were dismantled, replaced by government-imposed councils with compliant leaders. Resulting power struggles created lasting divisions within tribes. Agricultural policy became a tool of cultural change. The government pushed farming on nomadic peoples, distributing seeds and tools without adequate training or consideration of local conditions. Failed agricultural efforts deepened dependency. The post-Little Bighorn policy changes marked a fundamental shift in the U.S. government's view of Native peoples. The goal was no longer just control, but complete cultural transformation. The victory at Little Bighorn, which briefly seemed to preserve traditional ways, instead triggered a federal response that accelerated their destruction. These policies, born in the shadow of Little Bighorn, shaped Native American life into the 20th century. Their legacy persists in ongoing struggles over tribal sovereignty, cultural preservation, and self-determination. The battle that began with gunfire on the Montana plains continued through laws and policies that reshaped Native American life more profoundly than any military defeat. Each shovelful of Montana soil uncovered new insights as archaeologists meticulously explored the Little Bighorn battlefield. The systematic study, beginning with a major survey in 1984, revolutionized our understanding of June 26, 1876. The blend of modern science and historical inquiry stripped away decades of myth, revealing a battle far different from the one long etched in public memory. A pivotal moment came in 1983 when a prairie fire cleared thick vegetation, exposing artifacts hidden for over a century. The scorched earth revealed cartridge cases, bullets, personal items, and military equipment fragments, offering a new narrative that challenged long-held assumptions. Distinct ammunition patterns transformed historians' understanding of troop movements. Each cartridge case bore unique marks from its weapon, allowing archaeologists to trace individual soldiers' paths. This evidence showed that Custer's troops did not make a legendary last stand, but broke into smaller groups, overwhelmed by superior Native American tactics and numbers.
Personal artifacts added a human dimension.
A carved pipe stem, glass beads, a silver watch stopped at its owner's death. Each item enriched the narrative, connecting to the men who fought and died.
New technologies turned the battlefield into an outdoor laboratory. Ground-penetrating radar revealed hidden burial sites and combat zones.
Advanced metal detectors located thousands of artifacts, adding pieces to the battle's puzzle.
Forensic analysis of remains offered new insights into the battle's final moments.
Modern techniques revealed shot trajectories, weapon types, and a sequence of deaths, suggesting a chaotic end rather than an organized defense.
Native American artifacts forced a reassessment of traditional narratives.
War clubs, arrow points, and personal items revealed sophisticated tactics and organization, confirming oral histories long dismissed by white historians.
Environmental archaeology clarified the 1876 landscape.
Soil, plant, and erosion analysis showed how terrain influenced the outcome, highlighting Native American warriors' strategic use of the land and the cavalry's disadvantage. Recovered cavalry equipment, spurs, saddle parts, horseshoes, tracked-mounted troop movements, suggesting many fought dismounted after losing horses early.
This explained the cavalry's vulnerability.
Ballistic analysis of ammunition revealed Native American forces often had superior firearms, including repeating rifles, explaining their overwhelming firepower against the cavalry's single-shot carbines. Geographic Information System (GIS) technology mapped artifact distribution, revealing combat patterns and reconstructing the battle with unprecedented accuracy.
It also identified unexplored areas for future study. Ongoing archaeological work continues to yield discoveries.
New technologies like LiDAR reveal subtle topographic changes, while drone surveys offer new perspectives.
Each season brings fresh insights.
Archaeological evidence has bridged written records and Native American oral histories, confirming tribal accounts and forcing a re-evaluation of traditional narratives.
This convergence has created a richer understanding of the battle.
The archaeological exploration of Little Bighorn demonstrates the power of science to illuminate history. Each artifact, pattern, and analysis adds depth to our understanding of this pivotal moment, ensuring that new discoveries continue to refine our view of the battle. Atop Last Stand Hill today, visitors encounter a landscape where past and present merge. The wind through the prairie grass carries echoes of history, while interpretive centers and memorials tell an evolving story. The Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument has grown from a military memorial into a space where multiple perspectives on a defining American battle intersect. The Indian Memorial, dedicated in 2003, symbolizes this evolution. Its circular design, rooted in Native American symbolism, contrasts with the white obelisk marking the Seventh Cavalry's position. The monuments create a visual dialogue about memory and reconciliation, honoring Native American warriors alongside cavalry soldiers. Modern interpretation moves beyond the Custer's Last Stand narrative. Rangers and Native American interpreters present a nuanced view, exploring the cultures, policies, and lasting impacts of the battle. The story spans centuries of cultural interaction, not just a single day of combat.
The landscape itself teaches.
Markers show key events while preserving the 1876 terrain. Smartphone apps and GPS-guided tours let visitors hear multiple perspectives at specific locations, making the landscape vivid.
Educational programs reach diverse audiences.
School groups from reservations and cities engage in tailored programs, with young Native Americans serving as interns, bringing cultural perspectives.
This ensures new generations grasp the battle's complexity and relevance. The monument fosters healing.
Annual ceremonies unite descendants of warriors and soldiers, transforming adversaries into partners in preserving history. Native elders conduct ceremonies, reconnecting with ancestral grounds and bridging cultural divides.
Ongoing research enhances understanding.
Archaeologists use new technologies, while historians collaborate with Native communities to document oral histories.
This keeps the site's interpretation dynamic. The Visitor Center is a sophisticated educational hub.
Interactive exhibits explore the battle's context, humanizing the conflict with personal stories and explaining tactics and terrain.
Native American displays provide context for the conflict's stakes. Conservation protects the landscape and its significance.
Restored prairie grasses recreate the 1876 scene, archaeological sites are preserved, and new facilities minimize impact, balancing access and preservation.
The site hosts discussions on American history and identity.
Conferences bring together scholars, tribal representatives, and the public to explore military history, cultural preservation, and contemporary issues like tribal sovereignty.
The monument embraces multiple truths.
It acknowledges the heroism of both sides, the tragedy alongside its significance, and honors both cavalry discipline and warrior traditions. This layered interpretation helps visitors see history's varied meanings. As the sun sets over the Little Bighorn battlefield, it lights a landscape that teaches, heals, and inspires. The monument testifies to how history's understanding can grow more inclusive, reminding us that historical sites evolve, generating new meanings for each generation. The Battle of the Little Bighorn remains a living part of America's dialogue about its past, present, and future.